All right. Good morning, everyone. Officially, welcome to Wednesday. How'd the quiz go yesterday? Bad? I saw a head shake. No good. Felicia seems confident. Kenny, what do you think? How'd the quiz go yesterday? So-so.
What if you misspelled something?
What if you misspelled something? As long as I can figure out what you were trying to spell, then we're okay.
For example, I spelled as ACA, not A.
Sure. Good enough. You know,
What if you wrote Aken instead?
if you, well, I'll see. Yeah, if you spelled Akkadians like Egyptians, then no. But if it's close to the word, maybe. I'll have to look at that one, Victoria. Yeah, so again, spelling doesn't really count, but again, the clearer you can communicate to me, the more marks I can give you in theory. Yeah, so. Anything you would do differently next time? Different things you would study, or
Watch the movies again. Watch
you'd,
the films again.
you'd watch the movies again?
Yeah, I just read the PowerPoint,
Uh-huh.
and I think it's not enough because in the PowerPoint it's not honest. And I thought that the film that I watched in class is okay, but in the quizzes,
Hard to remember all those things later, right?
yeah.
The question about the brain process.
Yeah, it is
What was
like
the answer?
the circle and the triangle in the film, in the movie, yes.
It was that video,
Yeah,
yes.
but we should like put ourselves in imagine ourselves in the movie that brain do this.
Yeah, so he said, Jonathan Gottschall said that, we can review this tomorrow, but he said that when people are engaged with story, the part of their brain that lights up is the part that's actually experiencing the emotions of the characters, right? So if you see a movie and someone is sad on the screen, the part of your brain that lights up is not the part that's watching someone be sad, it's the part that is sad, right? So you kind of experience these things going along with it. However, you could also, I think for that was kind of what I was looking for, but I think there's also a reasonable answer in saying that when people are engaged, they sort of, they impose a story structure on what they see, right? So the geometric shape thing, Jonathan Gottschall's point was that we just can't help but impose a story structure on that, even though it's just geometric shapes moving around and it's nothing. Our minds want to give it a story, right? Our minds want to sort of create some kind of narrative for this thing. So the first answer is really what I was looking for, but if you said the second thing, I think that's valid. That's a reasonably valid answer to that question, so I'll give you marks for that one, just in case you went in a different direction. But yeah, so yeah, a good thing to do would actually be to, type or write notes as answers to the questions in the video, right? Because those are not necessarily in the PowerPoint, and that's why they're on the screen and on Teams for you, so that you can do that, right? If you don't do it, then you don't have it, and of course, you don't want to be watching the movies over again before a quiz. It's kind of a waste of time. We watch them in here, and I ask you those questions, and we go over them so that you have that stuff ready for the quiz, right? So don't watch them again, just take some notes while we do it. Okay?
We get stressed in quiz, and our brain can't work as well as like working class because of that. I said.
Yeah, well, it's true, right? Quizzes are a different thing, and they're an artificial thing, right? Because sometimes, in most workplaces, you don't really have to take quizzes or exams, but that is kind of how we do it here sometimes. Anyway, that's another thing. Okay, let's get going here. So Kayla's here. Good morning, Kayla. Harry is here. Good morning. And Mike is also here. Good morning. Good morning, Mike. Okay. So let's finish ancient Egypt today, okay? Now, last time we were looking at ancient Egypt was, I think, Thursday, which was a quiz and a long weekend away from now, so that was a long time ago. I had asked you these questions, and I won't really go over them all again. I'm just going to leave them for now. We did talk about the kind of social hierarchy or the social pyramid in ancient Egypt, and we said, again, there's lots of different types of people in ancient Egypt, right? People with different jobs, different responsibilities, and kind of different levels of power, right? And so it goes all the way from slaves who are owned as property, all the way up to the pharaoh, who is literally thought to be a god on earth, right? So it's a pretty tall pyramid in ancient Egypt when it goes from slaves to gods, right? But as you can see, we've got government officials and some sort of high-ranking generals. We've got people who are responsible for keeping records, right? Because not everybody can read and write in this society, or really in any ancient society. So you need people who are trained to read and write. Pardon me. You've got merchants and you've got craftsmen. Mostly what you have is farmers, though, right? Most people are still farmers in these situations. Now, I wanted to go back to this because we watched part of it in kind of a rush on Thursday, and again in the spirit of maybe actually taking notes on some of the questions from videos. I'd like to go back to this and just watch the last bit of this video on Ka and Merit, and again give you the opportunity to actually take notes on the answers to these questions so that when I ask them on the next quiz, you'll nail it, okay? So what we'll do is we'll watch the rest of this, answer the questions, we'll do a quick review on Egypt, and then we'll be into India. Coolio? Okay. So for online people, again, the questions are on Microsoft Teams, as is the link. We're going to watch from 33:48 to the end of it. We'll talk about the questions, and then we'll do a bit of a review, okay? So here we go. Online people, we'll see you in just a few minutes. All right. Very interesting. You know, this is the amazing thing about cultures that we're able to read their language, right? Is that we know a surprising amount of detail, right? We kind of get a sense of who these people were and what they did and when they died and who their family was and even, you know, maybe who took care of this guy as an old man. It seems maybe the daughter did. Like, this is a lot of information for people who lived thousands of years ago, right? And interesting because it really humanizes them, right? It makes us kind of understand that there were, you know, real people like us living at that time, right? With kind of all with their individual story. But so, what was the unit of measurement in ancient Egypt? It's a cubit, yes. And what's it based on? Yeah, it's based on. Yeah, so it's kind of divided into fingers, but also into palms, right? So about 7 palms. I don't know how big your palms are, but about 7 palms wide, and then there's, divided into fingers, right? And I think it might have even been divided into smaller amounts as well. That gold cubit that she was showing us there, I could see there were tiny little gradations on the side too. So there were almost like millimeters, if you will. I don't know what the ancient Egyptians called them, but there was even smaller gradations there.
They built that place with this measure.
Yeah, they built everything.
They put the measure in the wall. They see like highlights of each 7 palms.
Yeah, they went into that tomb that wasn't entirely finished, right? They kind of stopped halfway and left it. But yeah, you could still see the marking points, right, where they had measured out how many cubits it would be, right? Because someone like Carob would have designed all of the rooms and how they were laid out, and so they measured them all out, right? And they built all their stuff with a measurement, right, which you need. What did we learn about Hathor? Who or what is Hathor? What? She was? Yeah, so she had a big temple, right? Hathor had a really big temple. And she's what? Yeah, so she's kind of a mother figure, kind of a very womanly figure. I think, you know, our host here said something like she was, you know, this goddess, like a woman who had everything that, you know, all women looked up to. And I think I sort of joked. I said, oh, it's like Beyonce, but maybe she's the Beyonce of ancient Egypt, right? Hathor is this kind of very womanly, very powerful god, right? And she's in charge of childbirth, but also sexuality and maybe a little bit of, you know, protection of women and protection of the home as well, right? She takes care of all of these things, right? And sometimes we see Hathor as a cow, right? It's because she's associated with a cow. So sometimes Hathor is a cow. Sometimes she's a woman with cow horns kind of sticking out of her head. Sometimes she's a woman with big cow ears sticking out of her hair. Either way, she's a kind of a mother fertility kind of goddess of women, if you will. There's a bit of a typo there, but how did the Egyptians think about women's health? What were some of the things we learned about that? Yeah, so if a woman, I think it had to do with a pregnant woman, but I'm not sure. Yeah, if she was experiencing kind of pain and like, you know, tightness in her calves, then here's what you do, right? You mix up this carob and incense and milk, and you boil it up and you drink it. Carob is a bean, I think, or a root, a bean. Carob. It's a food of some sort. I'll let you Google it. Carob. I forget if it's a root or a bean or something else. But yeah, so we heard a little bit about how to cure someone, right? Some sort of mixture to make people feel better, right? What else did we hear about women's health? Yeah. Well, one organ in particular. Yeah, it was the womb, right? So a woman's uterus, where the baby grows. The ancient Egyptians thought that this could move all around a woman's body, right? And so if women weren't feeling well, sometimes it was because their uterus was moving around all over the place, which is bizarre, right, and not true. But interestingly, they're not the only culture to have thought that. What else do we hear about women's health? Maybe something that we know already, but for ancient cultures before medicine and antibiotics and things like that, childbirth was a really dangerous time, right? And so lots of women died in childbirth and lots of children died in the process. And so nowadays it's always, if you're going into the hospital to give birth to a child, it's always a scary thing. It's a pretty intense thing. But thousands of years ago, it would have been much more so because many women died in the process. And so here you can see, what does she say that they were trying to do? There was that big kind of, she was in that museum and there was that big piece of writing kind of backlit. And she said that, all of these kind of remedies like the Carob and spells and things like that, what did that help to do? Yeah, to protect the child and the mother, yeah, but maybe more generally. Sure, right? There were things that you could do. Give a little offering to Hathor to say, please help me conceive a child, right? Please help me get pregnant. Definitely. But what else did all of that knowledge do? Huh? I think, if I'm not wrong, I think she said that it helped the ancient Egyptians bring some kind of order to, a sort of a dangerous time, right? And an uncontrollable time, right? So, when a child is being born, it's kind of chaotic, right? And things are out of your control, and you have to breathe through it and hope everything goes well, but it's a scary time, right? And so here the Egyptians are kind of doing all of these things. They're saying these prayers. They're saying, drink this, or stand over the incense, or whatever it is. And a lot of this stuff probably didn't work very well. Maybe it helped people feel better or feel calm. Probably didn't work as medicine. But again, they're imposing order on the universe, right? Just like all of those myths, right? In those myths, there are things about the world we don't understand. And so how do we understand them, right? How do we create some sort of order, right? Maybe we create gods, right? Or maybe we create prayers and rituals, right? That, probably didn't do anything, but it helped them to feel better, and it helped to kind of organize and sort of structure this event, right? Which is chaotic and frightening and stressful, right? Sometimes. There's a typo in this one too, yikes. How were colors significant in the ancient Egyptian temples? Say that again?
Yellow.
Yep.
Examples.
Yeah, yeah. She showed us how where some of the colors came from, right? So
They use them from some stones, I think.
yeah,
Some of them make the red color, another will make the yellow color.
yeah,
And they painting with that stone, I think.
In like they color because at past they're like somebody are interested in drawing
yep,
and coloring the like prayers book. They're like very interested people and they like color with the stones
yeah,
and they like at first I don't know what the meaning of this word but they make a color
yeah.
and then they can like draw.
Yeah, yeah. So she showed us where some of the colors came from, right? Just simple iron oxide from desert rocks, right? Iron oxide, one iron oxide is rust, right? And rust is kind of a reddish, brownish, orange kind of color, right? But then there's other oxides of iron too that are a slightly different color, right? And so she said, look, you can very easily get yellow and sort of red just like this, right? But the greens and the blues are much more difficult, right? And I don't know how they made their blue and their green. I know that in ancient Greece on Crete, they used to make purple from a type of shellfish. They would collect them and grind them up, and you would get purple. And purple was a very expensive color in the ancient world. That's why often kings wear purple, because purple was very hard to make as a color. And so if you had purple, it was like, oh, you're super rich, right? And here in ancient
Yes.
Egypt, what's that? Yeah.
Because I know that because from one of the movies
Yeah.
that means like the kings wear purple clothes in their celebration.
Yeah. And again, one of the reasons they wear that color is because in the ancient world it was very difficult to make purple. And the same thing here in Egypt, blue and green are not easy to make. And so, yeah, a tomb or a temple that has lots of blue color, a very important, wealthy pharaoh made that, right? So it's interesting that we see all of these monuments today, and of course all the paint has, been eroded away and they're just kind of sand colored, but in the past they would have all been painted, right, with really bright, bold colors. Interesting.
Maybe they use green color as oxide of the copper.
Yeah.
It's green, I think.
Yeah. There's I think there's two oxides of copper, right? One is a little more blue and one's a little more green. Am I remembering that right? Yeah. But of course you would have to actually mine for the copper first. Yeah, it could have been from copper oxides that they got the blue and the green. That's a good.
And the colors, I think, will be different from the situation and situation. For example, if they wanted to show this extreme situation, they will use the colors that they are less than the other colors. As you say, for example, they use purple, then they use green or blue. It means that it's a serious situation.
Mhm.
It's important.
Yeah.
And here, you see that in the right, they try using a copper mineral in the lead sheet.
Malachite.
Yeah, and from the
Yeah.
and the green color is a symbol of rebirth, I think.
Yep. Absolutely. And that's why we see Osiris, he's always has green skin, right? Because he's symbolizing fertility and rebirth and regeneration, right? Because we know he comes back to life. How do we know that Merit died before Car? Poor Merit. Right? So we see in that little tomb chapel, we see some evidence of that. What else gives us evidence that she died earlier? Yeah, so there was a sarcophagus or a coffin that was made for Car, but it was Merit who was inside, right? And she's smaller than he is, but they didn't have one made for her. They had one made for him, and then she probably died unexpectedly, and then they buried her in that, right? How do we know that Car lived to be older? How do we know that he might have lived to be an older man? Something they found in his tomb.
From where?
It was something from Car's tomb that maybe indicates that he lived to be an older man.
Maybe from before.
Well, maybe, but they haven't unwrapped him yet. I think they've just sort of X-rayed him. But I'll give you a hint.
Oh, no.
I would say maybe translating.
Okay. Yeah. There's a couple of fancy kind of canes or walking sticks, right, in his tomb. And so, yeah, maybe he lived to be quite an old guy, right, and needed a walking stick to get around, right? So it seems like they had 3 children, and then at some point his wife died well before he did, kind of unexpectedly maybe. But Car continued to live on, right? And again, we see some images of that in that little tomb chapel, right? So yeah, this is pretty interesting, I think, because again, it really personalizes this culture, right? To say, yeah, I'm sure there were, thousands and thousands and thousands of people that lived in ancient Egypt over thousands of years, probably millions, but it's pretty interesting just to look at 2 people, right, and see the kind of life that they had, even though, they probably had a very good life. They probably made pretty good money for ancient Egyptians, right? They were able to afford a big fancy tomb when they died. Car got that golden cubit, right, from the Pharaoh, right? The Pharaoh saying, "Hey, thanks for doing such a good job. Here's this golden cubit for you," right? And so it was all kind of inscribed, and it's like an award, right? And an honor from a god, no less, which how many of us get an honor from a god? Not many, I would imagine. But yeah, really interesting to be able to see, just what two people's lives might have been like. And maybe the last thing I'll point out before I give you a break is it was really interesting to see her go to the village and see that one section of the wall that was still preserved, because you go to the village and it doesn't really look like much, right? Because all the walls have kind of fallen down and they're all kind of low, and there's no walls or anything to see. But imagine these houses at the time, with full height walls, and they would have had maybe wood or reed roofs on the top. All the walls inside might have been smoothed and painted white with all kinds of, scenes on them, and it would have been like a totally different place. But unfortunately, it hasn't really preserved, right? Just the foundations have preserved. Okay, you want to take a little breaky? Yeah, let's take a little break. Come back, we'll do a quick Egypt review, and then it is on to India. Okay. So let's tie up ancient Egypt here, okay? So what we've tried to pay attention to in this little unit on Egypt was the following things, right? Culture and environment, politics, sort of power and authority and governance, interactions and exchanges, conflicts and conflict resolution, values and beliefs, and cultural expressions. And so some of those we've seen a lot of, some of them we haven't really seen too much of. But I would just like to review what we've learned about ancient Egypt under those headings. And so I'd like to give you, I'm going to put some time on the clock here, and I'd like you to take a few minutes and just talk to each other about what we can remember about ancient Egypt here, okay? So I'm going to give you 4 minutes, I think. There we go. 4 minutes. Come up with as many things as you can that fit under those categories, okay? Things we've learned about ancient Egypt that we should remember going forward, okay? Talk to each other. Interact. How has the environment shaped Egypt's culture? All that stuff. Well, anything that's had to do with how the society, like, who's in charge of the society, who has power.
Oh,
Yes.
in the government, yeah?
Yeah. What have we heard about that? What's up with that? Okay, good people. Let's review this stuff if we can, okay?
What's the name of the god of sun?
The remain okay. So let's talk about this. So culture and environment. What have we learned about ancient Egypt in terms of the environment and how it's connected to their culture? Just shout it out. It's what? Yeah. Yeah, so it's another river civilization, right? So complexity develops around a river valley just like it did in Mesopotamia, and it kind of has to develop around a river in Egypt because otherwise there's just nothing else there, right? It's just dry desert, right? What else do we know about culture and environment here?
They start to use intensive agriculture, about modification.
They start to use agriculture and what?
Modification.
Right. So yeah, keep in mind the Egyptians start to use agriculture more intensively when, due to a climatic change, right? That area of the world gets a little warmer and a little drier. Places that are not by the river start to dry out when they weren't dry before, and people have to move in and settle next to the river, right? And so they have to start intensivize, is that a word? They have to switch to intensive agriculture. But also mummification, right? So the Egyptians have this very complicated process of preserving their dead, but there's kind of a natural element to that, right? If you bury a body out in the middle of the desert, it will dry out, right? It will mummify. And so they kind of were inspired by that and sort of continued to develop a process by which they could preserve the bodies of their dead, right? To the point where, again, even today you can go to a museum and see, an Egyptian mummy lying there, and they still have skin, right? They still have hair on their head. They still have a nose, right? And again, it doesn't really look very good, but it's preserved, right? They were able to preserve those things because of their technique, right? What else?
They're advanced in mathematics, science, and
They were advanced in.
engineering, mathematics, science,
Yeah. Yeah, these people were advanced in terms of, is that a culture and environment thing? No? It doesn't really, does it fit anywhere? I guess it could fit in cultural expression. But let's just say it now since we're saying it. Yeah, so the Egyptians were very, very good engineers and mathematicians, right? You can't build pyramids and temples and all the things that they built if you don't know the math, right? So they have to understand geometry, trigonometry, surveying, engineering, angles, all of that stuff, right? And they do, right? They know how to do that stuff.
You cannot say all of them were really nice, but maybe they have one genius,
Maybe.
and he or she shows them the road to
Well,
build the professional amazing structure.
Well, actually, they did. The ancient Egyptians did have the belief in this sort of one guy, Imhotep, who was kind of like a master architect, and he was the one who figured out, how to do all of the math and how to design pyramids and tombs. And so they kind of, it's almost the same thing as the Oannes thing, right? Cultures, every once in a while, a culture asks themselves, how is it that we know how to do all of these things, right? And so sometimes the answer to that is kind of a god, right? Sometimes a god came and told us. Sometimes it's one brilliant individual who figured everything out, right? But, in reality, it's more likely, a long process of people sharing and teaching and figuring things out and asking questions, and that this kind of knowledge is the product of a culture, right? I mean, we can do right now in 2021, we can do some pretty amazing technological things, can we not? I would say that we can, right? We can sequence genomes, and we can edit DNA, and we can create vaccines and send people into space and all kinds of amazing things, right? But would it be fair to say that Elon Musk figured it all out? No. Right? He's a smart guy. He's figured out some stuff, but he didn't figure it all out, right? That knowledge is the product of hundreds of years of science, right? And a lot of smart people sharing their ideas. And I expect in ancient Egypt it's probably the same. There's a lot of smart people sharing their ideas, right? Sorry, Elon Musk. I know you'd probably, if you're watching, I know you'd probably like it to be all about you, but it's not. Let's see. Any other culture and environment stuff?
About pyramids.
The what?
The bigger the pyramids, like it symbolizes their authority in Egypt.
Yeah. So the pyramid is kind of a symbol of authority. But the other thing that it's an interesting symbol of, and I'm sorry, online people, you won't be able to see this. Actually, oh good, I've got a marker. The pyramid shape, right? So if you look at a pyramid, you have something that looks like this, right, on the landscape. You see it from a long way away, and you see a pyramid. Some people have suggested that actually what this kind of represents is, you guys have seen this, right, when the sun is kind of poking through the clouds, and you can see the sun's rays coming down. You ever seen that? Yeah. So some people have said, actually what it is a physical structure that kind of imagines that light, right? And who's the Egyptian god who's up there? Ra, right? So this is actually kind of a symbol of Ra, right? Instead of the beams coming down, we have this stone pyramid sitting in the landscape, right? I don't know if that's true or not, but some people have said that that's where the shape comes from. That shape is actually the shape of the beams of the sun coming down, right? Which you can't always see, but sometimes you can.
But why there are many? Even it's not one pyramid.
Well, you needed one for every pharaoh, right? They don't like to share. I don't know. Initially there was, right? There was one pharaoh per pyramid. And again, a little bit later on, they, it wasn't really safe to build pyramids anymore because they kept getting robbed. And so that's why they moved those tombs to the Valley of the Kings, right? Anything else on environment? Maybe one other thing we could say is that all of their gods are anthropomorphic, right? They're like humans, but they also have animal heads, right? And those animals, of course, are animals that live in ancient Egypt, right? The jackal, the lion, the cow, right? The ibis. All of those are animals that are around, right? What was the anthropomorphic? ANTHROPOMORPHORIC. MOUSE. No, okay. Anthropomorphic means in the shape of humans. So anthro, I think comes from the Greek for man, and morph is shape, right? So in the shape of man. But of course, they also have animal heads in this case. Politics and power and things like that. What do we know about? What's that? We have pharaohs at the top, right? And what kind of power do they have?
Personification of God.
Yeah, they're a personification of the god, right? That's a lot of authority. right? Justin Trudeau only wishes he could have that much authority, right? Instead, all he's got is his cool hair. But poor Justin Trudeau. I pick on him a little bit. Yeah, so we have this. We have an actual God in charge of this society, which is pretty interesting, right? What else do we know about power, authority, and government in this society?
They have like military. Oh, nobles first, and then military, and then scribes.
Yeah.
And then merchants,
Yep.
craftsmen, and then peasant, and then slave.
Yeah. So we had a whole kind of social pyramid, right? With below the pharaohs, we have high-ranking government officials and soldiers and priests and scribes and merchants and farmers and slaves, right? We had all these different levels of society, right? What else? What? The what? Oh, taxes. Yeah. So this is a society that created an agricultural surplus, right? They grew more food than they could really eat, or if everybody was a farmer. So they kind of exchanged, right? They had craft specialization. Some taxes went to the pharaoh, to the state, right? Sometimes in grain, but sometimes, and this didn't come up earlier, but sometimes in work, right? So instead of just paying your taxes in grain, you might actually have to go work for the pharaoh for 2 months, right? That's how things like the pyramids were built, right? Instead of paying your taxes, you have to come to this location and work on the pyramid for 2 months. That's your tax bill, right? And so sometimes things are built with grain, sometimes they're just built with or sometimes the taxes are with grain, but sometimes with actual labor. People would work off their tax bill. Thank God we don't do that anymore. I don't want to go and build a pyramid for Justin Trudeau just to pay my taxes. That sounds like, never mind. What else? Anything else? I think that's probably it, to be honest. Interactions and exchanges. We didn't really talk about that almost at all. Ancient Egypt would have been in contact with other civilizations. So, the Egyptians knew about the Mesopotamian civilizations. They knew about those people over there. They probably traded and interacted with them a little bit. But, for a lot of the early history of Egypt, they were kind of on their own. People, left them to develop, kind of in isolation. So they were aware of the outside world. They traded with the outside world. And, as more civilizations started to develop, they would be kind of pulled into, sort of greater developments. They would be conquered later on. But that all comes in a few thousand years. Same thing with conflict and conflict resolution. I don't think we saw any of that, did we? Not so much? No, probably not. Values and beliefs. We definitely, yeah, what do we got?
Polytheistic.
Polytheistic, yeah, so there's many gods.
Ra is like the most respected god. There's Osiris, Isis, Seth, and mummification comes from Osiris.
Right. So we heard about Ra or Atum Ra or Amun Ra, kind of the sun god, the sort of the biggest of the gods, but also lots of others, right? Osiris and Isis, Seth, Nephthys, Horus, Anubis, Hathor. Boy, that's a lot of gods already, right? And there's more. Right, we heard about a bunch of gods. They're polytheistic. What else? Values and beliefs. So they had not only an idea of what the afterlife was like, a sort of a paradise,
But they live in birth.
but what?
They live in birth, I think.
They briefly.
Rebirth.
Oh yeah, yeah, and an idea that they would be reborn into that paradise, right? And so, but to get there, there was kind of a long series of steps, right? There was, your body had to be prepared a certain way. You had to be put in the tomb, and then, you know, your soul would enter the underworld, and it had to go through all of these things. It's quite a process to get to, you know, I feel like for Christianity, as long as you get buried, then, you know, God does the rest. You don't really have to do anything else. But for the Egyptians, there was lots of steps, right? Lots of things that had to be done. This didn't come up either, but it might interest you to know that, you know, the Egyptians' idea of heaven or paradise or wherever you go, interestingly, it was a lot like their regular life. So the sort of afterlife for Egyptians really looked a lot like the world they came from, which is pretty interesting, right? If you're going to imagine a paradise to live for eternity, and you can imagine anything you want, living in the clouds or living in space or whatever you might imagine, but the Egyptians imagine a life that's pretty much like the life they already live. That says something about how much they enjoyed their lives, I think, right? To imagine that paradise would be pretty much exactly the same as their lives already were. It's pretty impressive, right? Other values and beliefs. What? What about the gods? Say that one more time.
They have the relation, so they respect the God. They do reveal a secret for the God.
Sure, yeah. So they have gods. The gods are to be respected and honored and sacrificed to and given, you know, and prayed to and all of those things. Absolutely. Absolutely. I guess maybe the only other thing we could say is that this was a very religious society, right? So religion kind of permeated every aspect of their lives, and of course, you know, if the leader of your state is an actual god, everything you do becomes religious, right? Paying your taxes is religious because your taxes are going to the god, right? So everything the Egyptians did was, you know, was an expression of religious belief. And speaking of expressions, cultural expressions, how did this culture express itself? Through what? I didn't hear any of that.
You talked about that before when we were talking about culture and
Yeah. Oh, okay. Right. So it was the.
engineering.
Oh, right. Their math and science know-how. Right. They expressed what they knew about the world and the universe mathematically in some cases. Right. So that's true. What else? The what? Yeah, mummification is an expression of cultural belief, right? A belief in the afterlife, a belief in rebirth, right?
The sense of color, like they use color to determine or express their culture, like your religion or your class in the society. They use color.
Oh yeah, color. I guess color is an important part of probably every culture, I would guess, right? We all have, you know, all of our cultures use color in different ways, right? And so the Egyptians, of course, were no different. They had colors that were symbolic of things, colors that showed up in one context but wouldn't show up in another, right? We all have that, right? We all have ideas about, you know, what colors are, you know, appropriate, right? Why are we all not wearing neon pink right now? Right? Because it's a bit much, right? We don't, It's a very loud color, it's very bright, and it's not really an appropriate color for school, right? Our fashion sense is more a little restrained, right? Nobody in here is really wearing a very bright color, right? And so, again, we all have different conceptions and ideas of color and what colors mean what, and the Egyptians did as well, right? And they used the color to express various things. What else did we see from them? We saw some. What's that? Saw lots and lots of art, right? And the Egyptians are very kind of prolific with their art in terms of painting and sculpture and engravings on the sides of buildings and things like that. Lots and lots of artwork, right? But very consistent artwork, right? An artwork that has a style that really doesn't change that much. Really until, for ancient Egypt, it really doesn't change until about 300 BC when Egypt is conquered by Alexander the Great. Well, actually, it's a little bit later than that because Alexander doesn't really do anything. He conquers Egypt and says, okay, I'm in charge of you now, right? And they all nod right, and he says, okay, I'll see you later. And he took off and continued to conquer other areas of the world. It was really only when his general Ptolemy came back and started to rule Egypt that things started to change. But yeah, it remained very stable for a long, long time. Anything else? What's that? Oh yeah, their measurement, the cubit, right? So they devised a system of not only math and engineering, but also of measurement, right? Which again is important. You can't build pyramids if you don't have a measuring tape, right? You need to know how to measure things. And so the Egyptians created a unit of measurement, right? Very interesting, of course, that they chose to use hands, right, to create their system of measurement, because what did people do much later? Yeah, they used a foot, right? And some of us still do use a foot, right? And I don't know whose foot it's based on, but somebody's foot was 12 inches, and so that's now a foot. So again, we can kind of maybe laugh at the Egyptians and say, oh, here they are, making up some sort of unit of measurement. But here in the West, we did the same thing. We created a foot, right? And a foot is about the size of someone's foot, right? Anything else? Literature? Oh yeah, yeah. We heard only the titles of them, but from that village we found lots of love poems, right? People writing things to their beloved and saying that their heart aches, they're breathless, they have butterflies in their stomach, right? All these kind of romantic-y, sappy things, but yeah, the Egyptians are doing that too, right? Writing little love poems to each other, but writing other stuff as well, right? The story of Set and Osiris and Isis, it's a story, right? That's a story that was written down as well, as was the Book of the Dead, right? A kind of a description of what you had to go through in the underworld in order to enter paradise, right? They express themselves that way as well. All kinds of stuff. Wow. Anything else? Marriage? Yeah. So yeah, the Egyptians were a culture in which men and women got married, right? Which is interesting because we do the same thing nowadays, right? We often marry each other. What else? Wow, that's quite a list. We have learned a lot. Let's see. Okay. I think that's pretty good. I think we've kind of learned a lot. This is a fascinating civilization. I could spend much more time looking into these guys, but of course, we must move on. So what I'll do is tomorrow, I'll try to get your quizzes back to you, and then we will begin with India, which is also super fascinating, but in a different way. So I'll leave it there. You can pack it up, and I'll see you tomorrow, okay? All right.